Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for American Progress. This morning's program will be starting in just a few moments. If you all could do two things for us, please. First, silence all cell phones. Secondly, there will be a question and answer portion at the end of the program. If given the microphone, please state your name, affiliation, and ask a brief question. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Winnie Stackelberg, and I serve as Executive Vice President of External Affairs here at the Center for American Progress. And I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us for this incredibly important conversation. We're here today to talk about how we can help defend many of the most vulnerable people in our country. Today, there are about 16 million infants and toddlers living in the United States. And about half of them are growing up in families that live paycheck to paycheck. No parents should ever have to face the heartbreaking decision about whether they should spend their last dollar on buying groceries or taking their kids to the doctor. And as a society, we have a basic responsibility to provide all our young people with the support they need to grow up and earn a better future. But instead of providing more children with that support, Donald Trump is doing everything in his power to take it away. Trump promised to look out for families in our country who are struggling and striving, but now it's crystal clear where his real priorities lie. In a tax plan that would hand out $1.2 trillion in new breaks to corporations, businesses, and millionaires, breaks that would come at the expense of young children. Just consider a few of the staggering cuts Trump and his conservative allies have proposed in their cruel and monstrous budget. They would take food from the mouths of more than 3 million infants and toddlers by eliminating $200 billion in funding for SNAP. They want to deny doctors' visits and health screenings to nearly 7 million people by slashing hundreds of billions of dollars from Medicaid. And they want to gut affordable housing services that help put a roof over the heads of nearly 4 million kids. The American people are starting to see through Donald Trump's charade. Yesterday, voters decisively rejected conservative rhetoric at the state and local levels, which embraced the same kind of trickle-down tax policies backed by Trump and his allies in Congress. And what's more, there are now several new members in the Virginia House of Delegates who are the mothers of young children. They include Kathy Tran, who came to this country as a refugee from Vietnam and who welcomed her daughter Elise into the world just weeks before announcing her candidacy. And they also include Jennifer Carroll, who ran the majority of her race after her newborn twins arrived several months earlier than expected. And as a mom of twins, that is an incredible feat, and I know it. Every day she would knock on doors and talk to voters about expanding Medicaid, increasing teacher pay, and her past experiences as a foster parent. And in the evenings, she and her husband would visit the twins at a hospital in Falls Church. So it's pretty clear that infants and toddlers will have now some powerful new champions in the Virginia State House. But progressives can't become complacent. We need to do everything we can to defeat the agenda of Donald Trump and his conservative allies once and for all. We've already seen that open enrollment for the Affordable Care Act is surging despite the administration's best efforts. So let's keep spreading the word and encourage people to sign up for coverage by December 15th. It will take all of us, parents, child care advocates, and policy experts working together to keep winning this fight. That's why CAP is so honored to welcome this inspiring group of panelists who will be taking the stage later this morning. And it's why I'm proud to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Congresswoman Katherine Clark. Congresswoman Clark made it her mission to help women and children succeed since her days working at the Massachusetts Office of Child Care Services. As a member of the state legislature, she enacted laws to support homeless students who suffer from trauma. As Congresswoman, she championed early childhood education by introducing the Infant and Toddler Care Improvement Act. She's taken action to protect and strengthen on-campus childcare for college students who are the parents of young children. And she's introduced the 21st Century Child Care Investment Act based on a CAP report to expand access to affordable and high-quality childcare for hardworking families. Congresswoman Clark understands the vital role of fighting for better schools, housing, and health care, and its connection to providing every child with a fair shot at success. We're so grateful for her leadership and we're so glad she could join us this morning. So please help me in welcoming Congresswoman Katherine Clark of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Winnie, so much. And it is a pleasure and an honor to be here with this esteemed panel and with all of you. As Winnie mentioned, I never thought that I would run for Congress, never mind really run for political office, but I knew I wanted to be involved in making good policy for children. And I served for many years as the general counsel for the Office of Child Care Services. And, you know, we fought with that triangle that we balance when we talk about our kids and child care and early education, that how do we improve quality and keep affordability and access? And, you know, how do we do those three things for families and for the professionals who work as early educators? But I did run for office, thinking of the local races that went on across many parts of the country. I very bravely ran for school committee because I was so interested in early childhood policy and what we were going to do with full-day kindergarten in my hometown. But why I make fun of myself for the bravely is there were 8 people when I signed up running for 9 open seats. So it made it a nice race to start that I never thought would end being a member of Congress. But I think there is something to be said that we can run races based on the needs of families and based on the needs of children and women, and win and be successful and bring those policies to Congress with us. And I know that that is work that so many of you are committed to. And why do we need to make this such a priority? As many of you know, the research shows that it is that 0 to 3, our youngest learners, when brains are developing the fastest, when the synapses are forming, and that when we have early language skills, understand the relationship between cause and effect, that this can lead to the greatest opportunities for children. And the type of care that a child receives during these formative years really has an effect right through 12th grade and on into adult years. And we know that the key is making sure that kids are reading at grade level by 3rd grade. The bad news is windows start to close so early on our children, and how we make sure that when they're making that transition from reading from learning how to read to reading to learn, that they are at grade level. And that makes that 3rd grade and the early childhood experience so critical. And we know that stress and lack of nourishing experiences can lead to difficulty in learning, memory, language skills, and emotional control. And I think one of the areas that I've been interested in that is all tied into all of this is how do we help kids deal with the trauma that they are so frequently exposed to. And what we're seeing a trend across the country, and certainly in my home state of Massachusetts, that children who are dealing with trauma, either from poverty, exposure to violence, often have behavioral issues themselves at school. In Massachusetts, in the school year 2014 to 15, we suspended 603 preschoolers and kindergartners. This is not a policy that can help our children. We need to be looking at trauma-informed care, and as we really look at this, we soon discover that that also includes looking at our teaching professionals at all levels and making sure that we are dealing with their trauma so they are in a good position. Because the worst thing we can do is say to a child who is desperate for connection and for stability that now we're going to remove you from your school environment and add to that trauma by by suspensions and expulsions. We also know that by age 2, children in the lowest socioeconomic group fall behind their peers in cognitive, language, and social emotional development. So what should be our plan in Congress? Because we also know that investments in early education and care and early health care for our kids has one of the greatest public dollar returns that we know of. Conservative estimates, very conservative estimates, are around 10 to 1. Most people agree it's about 17 to 1. So this couldn't be a better place for us to put our public dollars and our public policy. But that is not what we're seeing coming out of Congress, coming out of the House last week with the tax plan that has been released. As Winnie said, nearly half of the 16 million babies in America are living in poverty. And it's one of the biggest challenges. Yet now we are seeing in our political world this failed idea that we can cut social programs, we can cut education, we can cut workforce training, we can cut health care, Medicaid, Medicare, and we can give these investments to our largest international corporations and to our very wealthiest Americans, and that somehow that is all going to end up promoting good jobs, promoting good education opportunities, and promoting a healthy economy. We have seen this fail over and over. We've seen stagnation of wages, we've seen jobs not being created, and we only have to look to Kansas to see how this played out in their state where all these policies were implemented. In Kansas, we saw the shortfalls and revenue losses continually fall on the shoulders of the most vulnerable. Schools reduced their operating schedules. Actually, we're starting to close in April and May because there wasn't enough funding. And public education and public health were decimated. This is not what we want to choose as a path forward for our American children. We know that not only will these policies have an immediate effect, but then in the long term, we're saying to these most vulnerable children, this deficit is now yours to shoulder. So we're going to get them when they're very young, and as they grow up, the deficit will be theirs that they have to contend with. And on top of this tax policy, we have a budget proposal that came out of this administration. The budget is a reflection of our values in the most basic and profound way. And I think that we should go over some of what we saw as the values of this administration proposed. If we start with nutrition, the administration's budget slash SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and WIC by $1 billion. That's with a B. The SNAP provides food assistance to over 3.6 million infants and toddlers in 2016. And WIC provides nutritional assistance to 4.8 million infants and toddlers. We know that hungry kids can't achieve, and we know this is key to their healthy development, having the nutrition that they and their moms need. And so to have this size of a cut is just undermining the basic health care that we are providing our kids. We also have to look at energy assistance and what the Trump administration proposed. It's commonly called LIHEAP, the Low Income Energy Assistance Program. And elderly and young children are particularly vulnerable to hazardous temperatures and to these cuts. 1 in 5 households that receive heating and cooling assistance under the LIHEAP program have at least one child under the age of 5. Yet this program was, the Trump administration decided to eliminate it which is not only devastating to the Northeast, where people rely on this in the cold weather and other parts of the country, but also in the southern parts of our country, where cooling is as vital as we see heating in many parts. The next area that I think we all need to pay attention to this budget and how it impacts children is affordable housing. This is an issue that is now also tied into the tax plan as we see middle class and low income families being squeezed by further reductions in what they can take as an interest deduction, what they can take in local and state taxes, making home ownership even more important. But housing subsidies make housing affordable for nearly 4 million children in the United States. And these, the cuts that were proposed would be absolutely devastating for children's health. And housing insecurity is associated with poor health, lower weight, and developmental risk for children. Just last week, I was at a transitions program in Cambridge, which is the name of a domestic violence program that they have that is very successful. But over and over again, the moms that were there, the counselors that I spoke to, cited affordable housing as the biggest barrier for these families. And as they are trying to leave violent situations, put their lives back together, bring that stability for their children and themselves, having a place to stay, having a home, becomes one of the toughest barriers to reestablishing their lives and security for their families. And so we have to look how affordable housing impacts families, their ability to work, the ability for children to attend school, the ability to build community. And we also saw most recently, we were down at a Homeless Horizons program in Boston that specifically has early education and care for homeless children, so that the parents have a place where these children have stability, they have a great early education experience, they have nutritious food, and it allows the parents and the families to be able to also have the skills in job searches, putting together a resume, finding housing, connecting with all those other services. But when we're looking at these cuts to an already stressed, subsidized and public housing budget, it's really it cuts across our communities, but the impact is going to be so felt by our youngest citizens. And finally, we have to look at healthcare. The proposals that passed in the House and that were debated in the Senate and ultimately not successful. There is, however, a bit of a zombie effect that just when we think they're dead, they come back in a new form. And we have to be very vigilant as we look at these tax plans because there is a lot in the tax plan that is undercutting our ability to provide Medicaid and Medicare, and will have real impacts on how we provide children health care. We know that 7 million infants and toddlers are counting on Medicaid dollars to be able to have screenings and treatments, and all of this is at jeopardy. And some of the tax plan that I've had it described to me as really cut these programs, cut Medicaid. The proposals we saw in the health plans were really about funding tax cuts for the wealthiest of Americans and corporations. And when that didn't work, we're just going to reverse order. And we're going to do these tax cuts and say we don't have the money now to provide the health care that we need. So all of us have to be vigilant in both of these debates that we're going to see really coming to a head in December. We have a tax plan that we're supposedly going to be voting on next week in the House, and we have a budget that is still unresolved that is coming due in early December. So both of these are on a collision course for our children. And we have to work together to make sure that the priorities of children are being heard. I'm very grateful to the Center for American Progress for a bill that Winnie mentioned, but it's the Child Care Investment Act. And I wish it was the type of bill that was in the tax plan discussion. This is a refundable tax credit for families making up to 400% above poverty line. And it was really with a cap at $14,000 that goes directly to child care providers to help pay for early education and care for families, which I hear from families across my district is one of the greatest burdens that they face. And as Winnie also made mention of my campus bill, as I go to community colleges in my district, I frequently see the children in the library while their parents are trying to further their degree, further their education to provide for these kids, but there's nowhere to take them. These are the type of bills, the type of tax credits that I'm grateful for the partnership of many of you in this room, but we have to keep working to put onto the front burner and make sure that they are what we are talking about as we go through these different discussions. We know that these are dangerous proposals, not only for our children, but really for our economy. And if we want to take all of our social justice arguments and the morality of providing for our children out of it, let's look at the impacts on our economy. And we know that if we are investing in children and the health of these kids and the education, then we are going to have a workforce of the future that we need. And we know that that is such a good investment in working parents and allowing them and our businesses to retain talent. I'm sure many of you in this room had the same experience I had when my children were little, when my husband and I realized that my entire salary was going towards childcare. And it wasn't a particularly good thought, but we were also in a very privileged situation where we had two incomes and we could work it out and I could stay in a career and raise children. That is not everybody's situation, and we have to continue to push our policies so that we offer this for all children and that we give everybody a fair shot at opportunity. So I'd like to close by telling you about one program that I was at last week in Dorchester, Massachusetts, which is a section of Boston. And I think that it was so striking to me, this program, and it's a powerful program in many ways, but it's called College Bound. And what they are doing is taking, they have hired people in their 30s and 40s who have been very gang involved. Most of them have served considerable time in prison. But they've come out and they've turned their lives around. And now they are recruiting the most violent or the gang leaders in Boston. And what they do with these gang leaders is say, we're going to send you to college. We're going to get you a GED if you need it, and we're going to pay for you to go to college full time. And it has an over 80% retention rate. And it has reduced gun violence in Boston, where it has worked in amazing ways. I mean, it is amazing to meet these people. But the relevance to us is that when you go into the College Bound program in Dorchester, the first 2 floors of their 3-story building are early education and care programs, because they know that those kids, the kids of the people who are in this program, the kids of the people in these neighborhoods, that if we can give them a fair shot, if we can get these kids the health care, the opportunities, the ability to have what they've witnessed in violence become part of building their resiliency and not hold them accountable for it as tiny children, through suspensions and expulsions, that we can change that whole community, and we can change the rates of violence and the rates of economic success. And I think that College Bound should be a lesson for all of us. If we lead with our children, if we lead with policies that are good for them, we are all going to win. And I am so grateful for the work that all of you do in your different spheres and the work of CAP to make sure that that's a reality. And we look forward to your partnership. And I think, Winnie, I'm going to take a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a passionate, dedicated leader. Fantastic. The Congresswoman does have a couple of questions before she has to head back to the Hill. So we've got a microphone. If you sort of state your name and maybe your affiliation and just a quick question, that'd be great in the back here. Thank you.
Mary Gant with the Green Science Policy Institute. I couldn't agree more with you about all the needs for children and health and education and social issues, but also environmental issues really matter too, and the EPA budget has taken a terrible hit. Children from the lowest economic end of the totem pole are often exposed more heavily to lead, arsenic, the heavy metals, and other environmental hazards. They need clean water. They need especially clean air. The advantages of cleaning up the environment to young children and to pregnant women are enormous.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would you comment?
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. And it is one of the areas I think that there's so much damage being done on the regulatory, sort of the sub-congressional level by this particular secretary and the EPA, and we all have to be concerned about that. It is terrible for our children who are so vulnerable, as we see asthma rates, all sorts of health indicators for pregnant women and for children. But it is also, you know, we have to be able to have resiliency for the future. We know that change is coming, and this climate change denying is just such a bad place. And I am delighted to see that we are seeing cities and states step up, but they are going to be limited by what they can do when we're seeing dramatic cuts to EPA. And I think that we have to keep tying it together. The environment is not something over here. It is critical to our health care and is critical to outcomes for children. And I think that if you look at, you know, voters, environment almost always comes in really low. And I think that's up to us to raise it up and say this is a piece of our health care, not only a huge piece of our economy and how we're going to, you know, look at resiliency for our coastlines, but you know, it's got to be made part of the healthcare debate that it's too often separated. So thank you.
Fantastic. And one last question over here on the aisle. Great.
Hi, my name is Sydney Davenport. I'm a journalist for Howard University. And my question is, you talked about the high rate of children that are being expelled from schools in your own state. And I was hoping that you could kind of give an example of something that you're implementing in your own state that's kind of worked for you, and that maybe we could take back to our own states as like something to really push for in terms of like keeping youth in our schools and not, you know, letting these negative impacts from their home life really affect how their education proceeds.
Yeah, and I'm sure, as you know, not only are these expulsion rates very concerning, but if you are a child of color, the rates are so much higher. If you are a child with a disability, the rates are so much higher. So this is all tied into many of the social justice issues that we are dealing with. We have sponsored legislation on the national level to really increase trauma-informed care, to make sure that we have resources going to help schools make plans, to help have professional development within that particular way of dealing with students. We also, on the state level, one of the first things that we did was keep good data. Unfortunately, most recently, our data showed we have a real problem in Massachusetts. But the data is part of what we need states to do, because if we don't understand who's being suspended and expelled for these in our youngest learners and throughout, but I think it really captures people's attentions with preschoolers and with kindergartners. That is the beginning. So I think having a good data plan, professional development, a focus on how we are going to actually make plans for schools and for child care centers and providers and how they can deal with trauma is going to be a way that we really need to start moving forward nationally.
Fantastic. Please join me in thanking Congresswoman Clark for your passion and your leadership. I'm going to turn things over to Katie Ham and our esteemed panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Go ahead. Sit anywhere. Thanks everyone so much for coming and joining us. I know it is a very busy week in Washington with the tax bill and conversation moving, but we think it's really important to take a step back and think about how all of this affects young children, babies and toddlers who are going to bear the brunt of some of the decisions we're making in the next few weeks. So I'm really excited to have our panelists here today. Thanks for joining us. I'll introduce them briefly and then we'll jump into a conversation. Immediately to my right is Kelly Ditson. She's a parent advocate from the Pittsburgh area. She has 2 sons, ages 2 and 6. She's a working mother who's been able to access help for nutrition, healthcare, and other resources to support the healthy development of her kids. She currently works as an assistant and receptionist in a barber shop, and she has 12 years experience as a server in the restaurant area. So thanks for driving all the way from Pittsburgh in the rain last night to join us for this important conversation. Next on the panel, we have Michael Linden. He's the managing director at the Hub Project, which runs the Not One Penny campaign, which is centered around the idea that we should not be supporting tax cuts for millionaires, billionaires, and corporations. He previously served as a senior policy advisor to Senator Patty Murray on the Help Committee, and he is also a CAP alumni, so we're happy to have him back. And he's also the father of 3 young children, so thanks for joining us. We also have Taryn Morrissey, Dr. Taryn Morrissey. She's an associate professor at the Department of Public Administration and Policy at American University. She's a developmental psychologist by training, and she's served in advisory roles at both the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and also on the Senate Help Committee. She recently co-authored a book with some colleagues called Cradle to Kindergarten, A New Plan for Combating Inequality. And she also has 2 young children. So thank you, Darren, for being with us. And then finally, we have Dr. Myra Jones-Taylor, who is from 0 to 3. She's the Chief Policy Officer there. 0 to 3 is a DC-based advocacy, research, and policy organization that's focused on making sure infants and toddlers all get off to a great start in life. Myra previously served as the first commissioner of the Connecticut Office of Early Childhood, where she oversaw programs on home visiting, childcare, and early education. Thanks again for joining us. I have 2 children, too.
Oh,
They're
she
not
also has
little,
2
though.
children. They are a little bit older, but we still welcome you on the panel. So I want to start by asking you, Michael, to kind of give us the current landscape. Last week, the House unveiled their tax plan. We've heard a lot of information about it, but can you give us kind of what do we need to know about this plan? Could you broadly frame what's going on in the budget and tax fight right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's bad. Next question. No. So the House is marking up its version of the tax plan right now, even as we speak. What we're hearing is that they're going to try and vote on it as soon as next Wednesday. This is a 500-page rewrite of both the corporate and individual tax codes, and they're trying to get it from introduction to passage in about 2 weeks. which is if the substance of the bill wasn't a total disaster, the process is. But unfortunately, the substance of the bill is a total disaster. The basic broad outlines, I don't want to spend too much time on it because I'm sure everybody's read it, but the broad outlines of the bill are a very large corporate tax cut that primarily benefits, of course, the wealthy owners of those corporations and executives, partially paid for with tax increases on working families. Some estimates are roughly 50% of all parents with children will get a tax increase under this bill. Very low and moderate income families are likely to get nothing at all. There are no expansions of any of the refundable tax credits that affect lower income families. There is an expansion of the child tax credit in the bill, a small expansion, not for very poor people, only for moderate or upper middle class families. And even that is offset by the removal of the personal exemptions. So not to get too deep in the weeds, but right now, if you have dependent children, you can take $4,000 per child off of your taxable income. And that will be gone under this plan. So the nitty-gritty specifics of the plan are really kind of galling for families with children. And the big picture is even worse. And the big picture is that this is a tax bill that is designed to deliver hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to very rich people, people who need it the least. And so, this fight is absolutely about equity and about investing in our future, and it's also just like basic decency and math. So this is the moment. We're in the moment.
So connect the dots for us. We're talking about this tax plan, $1 trillion in tax cuts for wealthy corporations. How does that relate to programs that serve infants and toddlers like Medicaid, like WIC, like special education, IDEA?
Yeah.
Connect that for us.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, the Congresswoman talked a little bit about this, but our budget process, the federal budget process, is very complicated and doesn't make a ton of sense. Congress can change the way it takes in its revenue without directly changing the way it does spending, but the things are connected. And eventually, whether it's this year or next year or in the future, Congress will come back and say, oh, we don't have enough money to pay for nutrition assistance for women and infants and children, or we don't have enough money to expand Head Start. And we know that that's what's going to happen. We've already experienced it. We have faced enormous cuts to some of these programs over the last few years, in fact, in part because conservatives, mainly in Congress, have said there's not enough money to pay for these priorities. Imagine what's going to happen when they've cut $1.5 trillion out of federal revenue. Imagine what they're going to say in just a few months, in just a few years, about whether we can afford to invest in childcare or home visiting. They're going to come back. They've already said it. Some of them have said it's a two-step process. We're going to cut taxes now, and we're going to cut programs next. It's coming.
Okay. And Myra, I wondered, the reason at the Center for American Progress the reason why we want to talk about babies in this tax fight is that in many ways they're the most vulnerable, they're most likely to be poor, and it's a critical developmental period. So can you give us, who are infants and toddlers in this country today? What are the opportunities and challenges that they and their families face?
Sure, and thank you so much for having this forum. This is great. So we heard earlier that we have about 16 million infants and toddlers up through the age of 3. They are growingly a more racially and ethnically diverse group of children. So now across the country, about 50% of our infants and toddlers are infants and toddlers of color. So we are changing demographically. We also know that in 2016, the percentage of young children growing up in poverty decreased. So we're doing better than we were. We were just below the pre-recession levels, right around 20%. And currently, largely due to Medicaid and CHIP, children are doing better health-wise, right? We have children who, we have a great percentage of children who are insured. Only 3.2% of children under the age of 5 are currently uninsured in this country. That is a phenomenal success, and we should all be, happy about this. Now is not the time to be turning back. Right now is not the time to be thinking about how we can be cashing our checks on the backs of these infants and toddlers, especially knowing what we know about infant and toddler development.
And that's a good point. And I was wondering, Taryn, if you could jump in and just kind of give us the overview of what's happening in these critical first 3 years.
Sure. The process of, and thank you again for holding this forum. This is a great discussion, important issue. But brains are built over time. And it begins before birth and goes through adulthood, but the infant and toddler period in particular is what's called a sensitive period. And this is when, in terms of, and the Congresswoman mentioned this, synapses and brain architecture is really happening at such a rapid pace. About 1 million synapses per second is estimated during these first 1,000 days of life. And this is an interactive process between genes and early experiences, but this is when children are learning for the first time what it means to be in the world and interact with the world, and whether they are, the people around them are warm and responsive and they are in a safe environment, and this is when stress and adversity is most harmful in particular.
And Kelly, I want to turn to you because you're a parent. You've had experiences with some of the programs we've talked about, and you've witnessed firsthand your young children growing up in the sensitive period that Taryn was talking about. So tell us about you and your family and your experience.
Yeah, I have my 2 boys, and for a few years I worked. I was a single mother, so it definitely was tough at times, especially working in the restaurant industry, where it's very unstable. It's very inconsistent. So budgeting and planning and that kind of stuff basically made it so that you were living day to day. But having certain programs to take advantage of, I think that is one of the main things that enabled me to move forward to the point that I'm at today, where I feel stable, I feel secure, I'm not worried. Where are you gonna be able to pay your bills? Are you gonna be able to, do you have to juggle things around, just adding all that stress to everything? But my kids have been able to go to the doctor regularly. They're both healthy boys. That's something that I've not had to worry about, am I going to be able to afford to take them to the doctor? Is this something serious enough? Do I have to judge whether or not I can afford to take them for something, or should I just go anyway? Just all that kind of stress and worry that you have with that kind of stuff. When I was younger, I came from a poor family, and I would go to school having not eaten breakfast, stuff like that, and I have taken advantage of the SNAP food stamp benefits for my children, and I don't think that they have ever had to worry about that. And that's something that, when I really, started thinking about this issue and coming here and, really trying to not take that for granted. And I think just having these kind of programs just shows that we support each other, we support our people, and it makes people like me very grateful and just want to, see the best in people that we can. Not be selfish, just look out for each other. I don't know, just like Michael said, like human decency kind of stuff. So.
And I think one of the really important things about your story that a lot of people don't realize is that most young children are living in families where parents are working, and you have always worked, but wages are low, and they don't allow families to necessarily cover their basic needs. And so programs like nutrition and healthcare and childcare assistance are kind of filling that gap for a lot of families. People who have young kids are at the beginning of their career. They don't necessarily have the earning power that somebody at the end of their career might have. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. So I think Kelly's story really emphasizes how important these programs like WIC and CHIP are. I was wondering if Taryn and Myra could kind of tell us more about what's at stake, what happens if some of these programs that Kelly used to help raise her boys and get them through this kind of sensitive period that our youngest is still in, what happens if they're not available to more families?
I think it's clear, one, we don't have mothers like Kelly up here feeling confident and being able to do all that I'm able to do as a high income earner that I can do for my children. So that's really important, and you can't really understate that. We know that families who are raising young children in poverty, those children face an uphill battle. We know the brain is resilient. Let me be very clear that there are ways for children to rebound. We are resilient human beings. But in the wealthiest nation, we should not have so many children playing catch up. It just doesn't make sense. It's not, we can do a better way. So we know that when children are playing catch up or when they have faced adversity, their brains, those synapses are not happening. They're misfiring. We're not rebuilding on the strength of all the potential that exists when a child is born. And what that happens is exhibits in the form of stress. We have lower rates of self-regulation and emotional control. We see children who act out in school. We see parents who then have to come home and take time off of work because they now have to take care of a child who's just been expelled. We heard that from the Congresswoman. So we know that this has a compounding effect, this spiraling effect that leads to stress. And we know in the body that children, this literally gets under their skin. We know that children who face toxic stress have higher rates of poor health outcomes, they do not do well in school, and then their later earnings are completely changed from the potential that they had when they were born because of the stress. So we know that not having these programs, not having a family who is stable, who can do all the things that I'm able to do, has an actual physical effect on young children.
I agree with everything Myra said, and we know from stories like Kelly's, but also from the research that programs like SNAP work. WIC works. It reduces food insecurity. It promotes children's development. We know that CHIP and Medicaid help families. They promote health among kids. They help family stability. There's even research showing that Medicaid helps increase credit scores. Has this cascading effect on families' financial stability and their ability to provide for their children in the future. It reduces payday lending. But we know that without these supports, children are at risk for short-term health problems like asthma or untreated conditions. We know that income, as the Congresswoman said, that income gaps are apparent as early as 9 months, but by age 2, the children from low-income families know fewer words, and they have poorer numeracy and literacy skills than their higher-income peers. And it's really hard to catch up. I mean, it's hard to catch up in kindergarten, but certainly later. And we know that into the teenage years and into adulthood, children are more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. They're more likely to receive public assistance later. So really, the science is extremely clear that promoting early childhood development during those early years in particular is not only more cost effective, but just more effective.
Yeah,
I
please.
just wanted to, based on what my fellow panelists have said, you hear conservatives sometimes saying we can't afford these programs, but just based on what you've just heard, you really can't afford not to do these programs. But just taking at face value the other side's kind of arguments around this, it's worth noting that in their tax bill, well over $500 billion is going to be spent on the richest 1% of Americans in the form of tax breaks. And just to put that in perspective, we could we could provide free lunch and free school breakfast to every single public school student in the country for the next 10 years for that amount, and have lots of money left over. So, this idea that we can't afford these programs, or everything's just too strapped right now and we've got to tighten our belts. It's belied by the tax bill that they are pushing right now, where they are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on people who could not need the help less. And I think it's important to put in perspective some of these huge numbers. We could hire 750,000 new public school teachers. We could provide childcare to millions of students, of young learners for that amount of money. It's staggering.
Yeah, we actually calculated just for the estate tax repeal, which goes to people who die with an estate worth more than $5.5 million.
It's about 2.2% of all estates.
Right. And you could serve 4.2 million children with child care assistance, just with that one provision that goes to multimillionaires.
And building on what Michael said earlier, too, we know that taking money away from low-income families does not work in promoting children's development, right? We know that Medicaid, other supports
Do we need
do work.
lots of studies for that?
Right.
We have them, though.
We do
We
have
have them. Poverty's bad for kids.
And
Taking income away, bad for kids.
Bad for kids.
Kelly, I know you've talked before and in the great video that you did about what this means for our value system and how this kind of resonates with you as a parent who's working really, really hard and giving everything you have to these young boys. When you hear this trade-off in this conversation, what does that say about our value system and to parents like you who are, just working day and night to give their kids everything they can?
I just think it just seems like it should be like common sense, like what to do. But I don't know, I just think people should just like look at the big picture instead of, like you're saying we can't afford it. Well, what really is affording something? I mean, can we afford it? We, as in the collective we. So I keep, like in the video and talking with everybody, just really just comes down to, in my opinion, it's important to consider everybody and, bring us all to the closest point of, stability and wellness and happiness that we can instead of having, just a few up here holding so much and then everyone else down here just left to, I don't know, struggle.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. We talked earlier about the child tax credit, and that's gotten a lot of attention in this conversation. It's something that Ivanka Trump and Senator Marco Rubio have really been promoting, and it's the response that we've gotten when we've said families are going to be worse off, we worry about these program cuts. Can you break that down for us a little bit more? Is that child tax credit going to address some of the shortfalls that families are going to be facing if these programs are cut? Is it going to help people like Kelly who are living paycheck to paycheck and working really hard?
I mean, the short answer is no. It won't even address the shortfall that people will face within the tax bill itself, not even accounting for the coming cuts to all of these programs and benefits and services and protections. Even within the tax bill itself, I mentioned earlier, roughly 50% of families with children will pay more in taxes, even with this expansion of the child tax credit. And the reason that is because they're giving with the one hand and they're taking with the other. And they're focusing obviously on the thing that they're giving. That I understand that's politics. But people aren't going to be fooled when they see on their tax bill that they can't take the dependent exemptions anymore. And they had opportunities. There are real opportunities in the tax code to improve it for families with young children. Right. For one thing, the child tax credit expansion could be larger. It could have expanded the refundable portion of the child tax credit. We could have they could have done a dramatic improvement to the child and dependent care tax credit, which right now literally benefits none of the people who most need it. If you are making roughly $30,000 or $35,000 or lower, you don't get it at all because there's no refundable portion at all. They could have done that. They could have done something like Senator Brown has proposed, or Senator Bennett, which is a very large expansion of the child tax credit, turn it into a child allowance. There are opportunities in the tax code to help families with young children, and they missed all of those opportunities.
And when there are cuts to programs at the federal level, oftentimes it's states that are left holding the bag, that kind of have to figure out how to make sense of all this. And so Myra, you've worked in Connecticut. Michael, I know you kind of looked at this and looked at Kansas at the hub. Could you guys talk about what are states going to do? How are they going to handle this? And the Congresswoman also mentioned the Kansas example. What can we learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the big question to talk about cascading effects. So states really are, and localities can be the hubs of innovation, and they can do amazing things. What we did in Connecticut around recognizing that the science around early childhood should translate into policy. And so we created a whole agency that focuses on young children and birth to 5. There are a lot of innovations that can happen, but they can only go so far without federal dollars. We are reliant on this system in our country. I think what the big challenge that we're going to face is whether or not states are going to step up. If people advocates, if parents like Kelly are going to step up and start demanding that we have a different focus, a different approach when it comes to infants and toddlers. And so one thing that we're doing at 0 to 3 I'm really proud of is this Think Babies campaign, where we're actually saying, let's make sure that policymakers are aware of the science. Let's translate the research, the science that we in this room know so well, and make sure that policymakers are aware of it. And so we did that at the federal level. We had a big campaign last spring, and now we're actually taking it to 5 to 6 states to say, we know the action is at the states, and let's make sure that our local and our state leaders are aware of the science and that they are actually translating into policy so that they're protecting the programs that they already have, that they're bringing state dollars into early Head Start and things like that. But again, without that federal support, this is going to be a much harder nut to crack.
I agree with all of that. I think there's 2 points I want to make about the state level. One is to look at Kansas, to follow up on the Congresswoman's remarks. Kansas implemented a tax plan similar in a lot of ways, directionally similar to what is being proposed right now. And the promises that were made are exactly the same, right? Enormous growth, more jobs, everybody's going to be better off. And we can empirically look and see, did that happen? They implemented these tax cuts 5 years later. What happened? And the truth is, by every standard, they failed. It's just an utter failure. In terms of job growth, Kansas lagged behind national job growth, but it also lagged behind all of its neighbors. So it wasn't just a regional thing. Its neighbors did better. In terms of personal income growth, same thing. In terms of population growth, that was another thing. They said people are going to move to Kansas because of our low taxes and create all these jobs. None of that happened. And what did happen, as the Congresswoman mentioned, is there were massive cuts to schools. And public health and construction projects and all sorts of things that we rely on.
Education.
And early education. Yeah. The cuts were so deep, the Kansas State Supreme Court said, you are unconstitutional. Your cuts are unconstitutional. You're not fulfilling your constitutional responsibility. It's worth noting that after 5 years of this incredibly failed experiment, Kansas legislature overturned a veto of the governor to block these, to repeal most of these tax cuts. The other quick point I want to make about the state and local level is embedded within this tax plan, most people have probably heard about this, is the repeal of the state and local tax deduction. Now, state and local tax deduction, we should be honest, is regressive. It does benefit rich people more than others, as all deductions do. It's not this panel, the discussion for this panel, but it does benefit rich people more than others. But what it also does is it helps encourage local and state governments to raise taxes to fund important investments, and it helps spread that burden around. And without that state and local tax deduction, it is very likely that a lot of states and localities will have to cut back on some of their local programs, and that's going to have that cascading effect that people were talking about.
I just want to underscore, I know you made this point, but children are often, almost always, the first to get cut. We really cannot afford, to Kelly's point, we cannot afford to do this. It scientifically doesn't make sense. There's reams of research. We do not need to make another report about why this is bad policy. And so it is so important for folks to really start thinking about channeling the needs of infants and toddlers and their families. So they can't speak for themselves. They can't advocate for themselves. So it's really up to us, to parents, to experts, to folks on the ground, to really start sounding the alarm about what we need to do for families with young children.
That's a great point. And I think we're going to move to audience questions, but I wanted to give Kelly the last word on the panel. What do you want your member of Congress to know? You're here in D.C. for a short time. What would you kind of say you want them to know as they consider this question?
Well, I just know that, kind of these proposals are, I don't know, it just feels like it's taking something, like you did, like Myra just said, children don't have a voice of their own, and it just feels like it's taking their opportunity away from them and just making things more difficult, and saying that, whatever we have to do now with the numbers and the budget and the economy, if that's not gonna benefit them in the long run, then how can we afford that? And maybe just, take a look at the families, talk to some families, and look at your own family. Is that something you would want to have to go through? You would want your children to go through? So let's just look at everyone rather than, just part of the picture. I would like them to.
That's a great
consider.
point. Okay, with that, we'll open it up to audience questions. Please raise your hand. Somebody in the third row. And if you could say your name and where you're from, and then ask your question.
I'm Joshua Perez. I live in the greater DC area, and I'm very fortunate. I actually have my mother with me at this discussion. But my question is that I have a lot of conservative friends, and their whole argument is that we really shouldn't need these programs. And by creating these programs, we're actually incentivizing or creating more of a demand for these kind of assistances. And so my question is, these programs like SNAP, WIC that we've been mentioning, to what extent are they alleviating the problems rather than dealing with the root causes that are creating the demand?
Speak to some of the research on that front.
Sure. Well, first I would say that the vast majority of people who are receiving WIC and SNAP and Medicaid are, like Kelly, working really hard. Most of them are working full time. 1 in 5 infants and toddlers have mothers who work low-wage jobs. That's about 10, 15 hours or less. I mean, try to make ends meet when you're a single adult, let alone with an infant or toddler. So one can work really, 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 really hard. That's not the problem. And when you have unpredictable schedules, that makes things even more complicated to arrange childcare. But I would say that these programs provide a backstop into people going hungry, children going hungry. They do not, I don't think anybody would choose to be on these programs if they didn't have to. This is something that families need.
Yeah, and I second all of that. I mean, I'd tell them, they should talk to Kelly, and they should talk to the president of the Center for American Progress, Neera Tanden, who will tell you her story of when she was growing up having to rely on food stamps, and where is she now? And many of the participants in these programs end up, they're on the program for a few years, and then they're not on the programs ever again because they needed them for a backstop just for a few years and to get themselves on their feet. And then they contribute, and they paid back. They paid all back in taxes. They paid back in raising their children to be productive members of society. I have a hard time really even understanding that argument, because it just means they probably have never spoken to somebody who's actually struggled and tried to and cared about their kids and growing up. Actually, it makes me angry.
And this is not a select group of people.
It's not a reflection on the question, but it's just,
I think it's also worth noting that the expenses that are associated with raising young kids hit right in their first few years. That's when you have the car seat, the diapers, the childcare expenses, the crib, and it's hitting you when you're just at the beginning of your career. And so that's why these programs can really help those families get through those critical few years.
Amy, please.
Can I add something just maybe for people who don't have experience, using these programs or really know many people. So on the point of, I know we've talked a lot about SNAP and childcare itself, because you hear people say, people who are on benefits and whatnot, they're just sitting around, mooching or, taking advantage of these when they may not need them or whatnot. But I think of all of the expenses that I have, childcare takes up the biggest portion of my income, more than my housing, more than my utilities, more than my student loans, more than anything. And so that's like a big factor, in determining how much you work, when you work, okay, how much am I going to make? How many days of daycare will that pay for? And then do I need to what are the hours? Like the daycare is limited. Is it a good daycare? Is it all of that? So I think that's part of the issue in, hearing about all these great programs and people who are working to, really improve that, so that people, okay, you're working hard, you want to progress and do well for your family, but you have to take advantage of these programs for a little while. So why not give people the tools they need to succeed and do that? That's just kind of, maybe helping put that into perspective a little bit.
I think that's a great point. And as Michael said earlier, this tax bill doesn't provide anything to help with childcare expenses. So it's helpful to hear that aspect of your story. Anyone else have a question?
I'd also add just about 50% of kids receive SNAP at some point in their childhood. So it's not hard to find people who benefit from and need these programs.
We have a question right here on the end.
So this kind of ties into what he just asked. He was talking about his friends, and I would say for people of around my age group, students maybe in their early 20s who don't have kids, who don't really understand what people who do have kids, even our age, are going through, what would you say to them about getting involved and, how they can kind of advocate and be advocates? Because I think a huge portion of it is that they just don't understand. So what would you say to people to get them to, one, understand, and then two, to kind of act on that understanding?
Well, do you want to talk about some of the advocacy that's going on right now and how people could find out more about what's going on in their area?
Yeah, there's a lot of activism happening right now around the tax plan specifically. So if you're interested in getting involved, I do think everybody in this room is here for a reason. Everybody cares about these issues and these questions. And as Myra said, the children they're not allowed to vote. We should maybe change that. They can't advocate for themselves as effectively, and we need to advocate for them. So if you are interested, I would definitely recommend going to notonepenny.org, which is the sort of overarching campaign site for people activating against this tax plan. You could also check out Indivisible. They have a great website called StopTrumpTaxScam.org, and there's like 70 different events happening all over the country this week. Sign up for one. Honestly, just raise your voice. Talk to your friends and family and say taxes can be kind of inherently boring. I talk about taxes for my whole life, and I'm like the hit at parties. But this is so important. This is so critical to human people, little tiny human people who are so cute, and we need to help them. And this tax bill is. It's really quite, I can't overstate how disastrous it is. So that didn't quite answer your question, but I really do encourage people to take this tax fight personally, in the same way that we took the healthcare fight personally, and it's going to affect you and your family and your community. The tax bill will do the same, and so I do encourage people to check out notonepenny.org or Indivisible or StopTrumpTaxCuts.org. There's a bunch of different websites, and there are ways to get involved.
And if I could just add, again, tax policy is the driver of all other policies in so many ways. So all the policies that we care about, the programs we care about, are really tied to this. So I want to underscore that. And I also want to put in a plug for the work if you really are interested in the role that these policies play in the lives of families with young children. I would love for people to check out our website, thinkbabies.org, so you can find out more about this specific issue around how policies that serve infants and toddlers really need to be brought to the forefront of our policymakers' minds, because it's good for families, it's good for this country.
I think we had a question over there. No? Oh, okay. Other question here on the end.
Hi, my name is Matt. I'm from the University of California. I guess this is a $1 million question, but what would you say to people on the other side of the aisle to really understand the effect that their policies have on America's future, the next generation, and what ways would supporting our next generation really have in terms of the economy and American progress? Like, what would you say to them to get them to understand that and to get them to support that?
I would say that we've had, and I really appreciate your question, because I think we have made significant ground when it comes to babies and policies, and this really should be and is a bipartisan issue. I mean, I know we're talking about tax policy, which it feels like babies are being mowed over, but I would say in families that there has been a lot of support for bipartisan support for the things that families need. So we've had bipartisan support for the reauthorization of the Child Care Development Block Grant, which was not without its challenges, but really did put a huge focus on access and quality and affordability for families. Infant early childhood mental health, which is something we care about dearly at 0 to 3, based on the science, has received bipartisan support. So there is hope there, and I think the message has to be around science. We know it is irrefutable that the first 3 years of a child's life there's no other time later in life when there's more significant or rapid development of the child, of the human brain. Again, not to say that we do not rebound and we're not resilient, but this is the critical moment, these sensitive periods that Taryn talked about. And so tying policy to that, sharing with policymakers what happens then and what families need, so how toxic stress interrupts that, how poverty interrupts that, how exposure to violence interrupts that, how food insecurity and housing insecurity all get in the way of the potential of a baby's developing brain is really useful in talking across the aisles, both aisles. So I would strongly suggest people talk with that language. And again, you can check that out at thinkbabies.org for a lot more information.
Great. Well, there are a lot of great resources, it sounds like, out there for folks who want to continue this conversation, continue this advocacy, and get involved. I think we're out of time, but I really want to thank our panelists for being here. I want to thank Lila Shochet at the Center for American Progress for doing a lot of the work to put this event together. And thanks to our audience for coming today and joining us for this really important conversation. Thank you.